Namaskar and welcome to the episode number 20 of the Indology podcast. In this podcast, I want to talk about a certain character from Bharatiya Itihas, a certain mysterious character about whom there's a lot of rumor, there's a lot of unnecessary controversy. The Marxist historians, of course, absolutely demonize him, have labeled him a villain and a bad character, so to say, but what is the truth in reality? Is it yet another case of a person being labeled as a villain by Marxist historians turning out to be a hero in reality? Well, the truth is rarely ever black or white, and the same is the situation in this case as well. I am, of course, talking about Pushyamitra Shunga, a supposedly controversial character if you go by the definition of the Darbari historians. To help me with this, I am going to read you something from a book written by Swatantra Veer Savarkar. The name of the book is The Six Glorious Epochs of Indian History. Now, what many people do not know, actually, is that Savarkar was a very good historian. Had he not spent the prime of his life in jail fighting for the independence of India, I have no doubt that he would have perhaps been a great historian. This particular book, Six Glorious Epochs of Indian History, is one of the last works of Veer Savarkar. And I can see why he felt that he had to write this. Because perhaps at that time, in the early 60s, he would have seen how the Darbari historians are falsifying history, how they are completely changing the narrative of Indian history, and how that would end up making the Hindu society rather weak, rather devoid of an identity. And that's exactly what happened. And I like to think that he perhaps wrote this at that time, thinking that there will come a time when Hindus will have a certain awakening and they will look for sources to know their real history. And fortunately, that is what is happening nowadays. So in this particular book, there is a mention of the whole episode of Pushyamitra Shunga and what happened to the Mauryans, and I'm going to read that today for you. One thing that you need to keep in mind is that the criticism of Buddhists in this particular text is not a theological criticism. The problem is not what they are praying to, what they are praying, any of the rituals, etc. This is a purely political problem. The problem is that a group of Buddhists ended up indulging in traitorous behavior towards their nation. That is the problem. And I'm pretty certain that if any Hindus had indulged in such behavioral patterns, the opinion of Veer Savarkar would have been the same. So please keep this in mind. This is not meant to demonize the Buddhists. Ashoka and his descendants, with their imperial support, carried throughout their empire the incessant propaganda of the one-sided extremist Buddhist principles, which derided martial prowess and criminally neglected the valor which fought for national independence. And because they transformed the whole empire into a gigantic Buddhistic monastery and converted the fighting warriors into saffron-clad Buddha bhikkhus, the heroic spirit amongst the people of the frontier provinces and their staunch patriotism suffered a horrible debasement, and the military organization, which had been the strongest in the world since the time of Chandragupta, wore out completely because of this internal virus. And that is the reason why Demetrius's Greek forces, far inferior to those of Alexander and Seleucus, could so easily reduce the whole region from the Hindu Kush to the Panchanad, and could march proudly towards Magad. With all the imperial authority and resources at the disposal of the Buddhists, none of the provincial governors, nor any administrators, nor even the Buddhist population got excited and boldly came forward to fight in the battlefield these Yavan foes who dared to snatch away the independence of India and subjugate it. They were not enraged at this insult of India, nor were they ashamed of it. The very descendant of Ashoka in Magad, who called himself emperor and was adoring the imperial throne, the Buddhist king Brihadrat, never took a step to resist the advance of the Greek army. The Vedic Hindus, at least, were highly enraged at this national insult and the imminent national calamity. Unfortunately, they had no political power left in the north of India, which could immediately resist this national calamity. But within a decade of Ashok's death, the provinces of Kalinga and Andhra in South India had renounced the paramountcy of the Buddhist Mauryas and established their independent kingdoms. The kings of both these provinces were staunch followers of the Vedic religion, and so equally staunch Indian patriots. Both of them had built up mighty armies well equipped with arms. The news that the Greeks had conquered northern India and that the Magad king, a weak Buddhist, could not at all resist it, caused a great furor amongst the Vedic population of South India. At last, the king of the independent state of Kalinga, the valiant Kharvela, decided to march himself at the head of an army against the Greek army of Demetrius. First of all, with a mighty army, he conquered Magad and joined battle with the Greek forces somewhere near Ayodhya. The strong Indian army of Kalinga dealt such a crushing defeat upon the Greeks that Demetrius immediately turned his face backwards and marched off with all his army back to his home beyond the Panchanad. After driving the Greeks beyond the frontiers of India, Kharvela did not find much time either to pursue the fleeing enemy or to organize the administration of the whole of that region. Political emergency drove him back to Kalinga almost immediately. As soon as he returned to Kalinga, Kharvela celebrated, according to the Vedic tradition, the horse ceremony, to commemorate the brilliant victory he had gained against the Greeks in defense of the honor and liberty of India. This horse sacrifice was particularly known to have a national and political significance. Besides, owing to Ashoka's ban, the Vedic Hindus were not able to perform any sacrifice whatsoever for the last 40 or 50 years. But soon after, the Vedic states were established in Kalinga and Andhra. This horse sacrifice, the first of its kind, was celebrated in total defiance of all the injunctions of Ashoka on the Vedic religious practices, immortalizing the crushing defeat inflicted on the Greeks, the national enemies of India. Seeing that Kharvela had returned to the south, Menander, who had so far stabilized his position in Cambodia and Gandhar, and who was furious at the disaster met with by Demetrius on his march against Magad, once again invaded India within a period of 4 years. Just like at the time of the invasion of Demetrius, so also at this time, the Greeks did not meet with any opposition worth the name in the Panchanad, which was dominated by the Buddhists and as such had become pacifist. The weak descendant of Ashoka on the throne of Magad too offered no effective resistance. On the contrary, Menander could enlist the sympathy of many of the Buddhists in his campaign, for he openly said that he approved of many of the Buddhist principles and that he was soon going to become a convert to it. So many Buddhist preachers began to publicize that the Greeks had come to fight with the Vedic Hindus alone, and that if they conquered India, theirs would be a Buddhist rule. The Buddhists were not much concerned with the alien nationality of the Greeks. Buddhism did not recognize the difference of caste, race, or nationality. This was the anti-national and anti-Indian wicked way in which the Buddhist preachers began to delude the people of India. As their sympathetic assistance was so useful to Menander, he too began to circulate through his Greek agents that this campaign of his was directed solely to nip in the bud the conspiracy of the Vedic Hindus to snatch away the imperial power from the hands of the weak Buddhist rulers of Magad. Menander came once again, reducing the Panchanad and other provinces right up to Ayodhya. In order to avoid the repetition of the sad plight of Demetrius, who had made undue haste at an inopportune time, Menander spent some time in Ayodhya, consolidating the newly won territories and replenishing his army before he launched an attack on Magad and waited for the auspicious moment. The Vedic community and their leaders in North India had already experienced a surge of heroic spirit because of the victory of the brave Kharvela of Kalinga. To add to it, the news arrived of Menander's menacing invasion. Besides, the Indian Buddhist populace showed clear signs of defection and betrayal of their co-nationalists to Menander. The nationalist Indian leaders, therefore, formed a revolutionary body with a view to dethrone the vacillating and weak Brihadrat Maurya from the royal seat of Magad and replace him with one of the Vedic sect, who was of proven mettle like Chandragupta Maurya. But everyone was confronted with the difficult question as to who was there so bold and powerful as to take the lead in this national revolution and to destroy the Yavanas Amongst the remnants of the Magadhan warriors in the army of the above-named Brihadrat Maurya was one named Pushyamitra. He was a Brahmin by birth. He was moreover a staunch supporter of the Vedic religion and Indian nationality, and was a devotee of Mahadev. His family name was Shung. Even in the Magadhan army, he had attained so much importance because of his military exploits that Brihadrat Maurya himself had appointed him, not very willingly but only out of necessity, to the office of the commander-in-chief of the forces in the face of the deadly war with the invading Greeks. The moment he got the reins of the highest military authority, Pushyamitra began to enlarge and reorganize the army of Magad and equipped it with all the weapons. This focused the attention of all the patriotic Vedic populace on Pushyamitra, the general of the army. Everybody anxiously hoped if General Pushyamitra should lead the political coup. Who else, they thought, was at that time fitter enabler than this valiant hero to ascend the traditional imperial throne of the Indian Empire? From the historically established facts of this Magadhan political revolution, it will be amply clear that General Pushyamitra must have accepted the leadership of this future conspiracy. It is very likely that he must have secured in advance at least tacit consent of his army and some of its leaders before he acted openly. While all these preparations were going on, one day it was decided to hold a grand military review in the vast courtyard of the royal palace in the capital city of Patliputra. Emperor Brihadrat Maurya was present there to witness the march past and receive the salute of the army. But while, as per Pushyamitra's orders, the ceremonial movements of the fourfold army and their different formations were going on with all pomp and show and noise and bustle, for some reason not known to history, some trouble arose near the place where King Brihadrat was sitting. In the excitement of the moment, General Pushyamitra marched on Brihadrat Maurya, who had come to be merely the titular head of the empire, and beheaded him. This chopping off of the head of Brihadrat put a stop to the dynasty of the Mauryas. The Buddhistic Mauryan Empire met its doom that day. This unexpected and horrible turn of events caused a great furore in the large crowd assembled there. But did any of the armed warriors or anyone from those of the royal household who was sitting near King Brihadrat attack General Pushyamitra? No, not at all. On the contrary, the whole army hailed him as their leader. For General Pushyamitra had done exactly what the soldiers themselves and many others wanted to do, but could not, as nobody in the whole of India dared shoulder the responsibility for such an hazardous deed. Pushyamitra had simply done the unavoidable national duty of killing Ashok's descendant Brihadrat Maurya, who had proved himself thoroughly incompetent to defend the independence of the Indian Empire. Chandragupta and Chanakya had to assassinate, as an unavoidable national duty, Samrat Mahapadmananda, who had proved himself thoroughly incapable of repulsing the Greeks for the protection of the Indian Empire and its independence at the time of the first Greek invasion of Alexander. And just for the same reason, Pushyamitra had to cut off the head of Brihadrat Maurya, the nominal Buddhist emperor, simply as a national duty. This momentous event took place around about 184 BCE, and with all the Vedic rituals, Pushyamitra was anointed Emperor of India on the throne of Ashok in Patliputra. It marked the end of the Maurya dynasty and the beginning of the reign of the Shungas. First of all, Pushyamitra stabilized the administrative setup and consolidated his position in his capital and the regions around it. And after mobilizing a strong fourfold army eager to fight, he fell upon Menander, who had so far dug in his feet safe in Ayodhya. Finding it extremely difficult to hold their ground before the mighty arms of the Indian army, the Greek general Menander began to retreat. Earlier, Demetrius had not been pursued, but this time Pushyamitra was not going to be slack. He chased and hunted down the Greek army, inflicting defeat after defeat on the Greek army and causing confusion in their ranks. Pushyamitra drove the dispirited and vanquished Menander far beyond the Indus. The Indian Empire right up to the Indus was once again set free from the Greek political dominance. This was the last of the Greek aggressions on India. This terrible defeat inflicted on the Greeks by Pushyamitra consumed their strength so much that they never had the heart to strike again at Bharat any time in future. Bharat thus annihilated this Greek army who had been a source of constant trouble since the time of Alexander. Pushyamitra annexed all the territory liberated from the Greek hands to his own empire. He appointed at Ujjain his son Agnimitra as the viceroy of the region. General Agnimitra was a brave and able commander like his father. He forced the land up to Vidarbha in south to acknowledge his overlordship. But later, Vidarbha refused to do so. Hence, Agnimitra attacked it. In the battle, Vidarbhadhish was defeated. Amidst all this confusion, Princess Malvika, the daughter of the Vidarbharaj, was enamored of the bravery and other virtues of Agnimitra and was very eager to marry him. So with the consent of Pushyamitra, the king of Vidarbha celebrated her marriage with Agnimitra. This not only created the bonds of friendship but also the bonds of blood relation between the two royal families. On this romantic theme itself has Kalidas composed his famous play Malvika Agnimitra. I want to say one thing here. What this battle tells us and what many of these battles between Hindu kings tell us is how different war was before the Abrahamic invaders came into our country. Agnimitra defeated the Vidarbharaj. He did not enslave him. He did not enslave his daughter, his wives. He did not break any temples. He did not insult his gods, which is what happened when the Muslim invaders came. This was the difference. When the Hindu kings fought each other, there were rules. But when the Muslim invaders started coming in, there were no rules to the fight. And that took our Hindu kings by surprise. Pushyamitra, who had completely destroyed the Greeks, the age-old alien enemies of the nation, and rejuvenated the Indian Empire, had acquired with his own splendid victories the right to perform a horse sacrifice, according to the Vedic tradition, the Ashwamedh Yagya. About this right of Samrat Pushyamitra, Vincent Smith writes in his early history of India that the Yavanas and all other rivals having been disposed of in due course, Pushyamitra was justified in his claim to reign as the paramount power of North India, and straightway proceeded to announce his success by a magnificent celebration of the Ashwamedh sacrifice at his capital. This declaration of celebrating a horse sacrifice by Samrat Pushyamitra thrilled the whole country with national pride and martial triumph. In the very capital of Ashok, who had deprived the Vedic Hindus of their religious freedom by means of his supreme political authority, was this Ashwamedh of Samrat Pushyamitra to be performed. This horse sacrifice of Pushyamitra was in fact a public imperial proclamation of Samrat Pushyamitra that all the restrictions imposed by Ashok on the religious freedom of the Vedic Hindus were withdrawn. Emperor Pushyamitra's grandson, Vasumitra, was also a spirited young prince, as his father Pushyamitra's son, Agnimitra, was a veteran army leader and an efficient royal administrator. When Samrat Pushyamitra let his sacrificial horse loose on its triumphal march through the land, the task of protecting that horse with a strong army was entrusted to this brave young grandson, General Vasumitra. The horse was not obstructed in his free ramble right up to the banks of the Indus. But on the banks of the Indus, he was opposed by a certain Yavan king, which according to the conventions of the time meant that the sovereignty of Pushyamitra was challenged. So the young General Vasumitra fought with the Yavan enemy and after defeating him completely, got released the ceremonial horse. The boundless joy that was universally felt in the capital when after a year the invincible and unconquered General Vasumitra triumphantly marched into the city can very well be seen in the formal invitation sent by Pushyamitra to his son Agnimitra, which is still available to us in almost the very same words of the emperor. Kalidas has practically reproduced it verbatim in his aforesaid play Malvika Agnimitra. That letter in the drama is so interesting that everybody might read it with pleasure. It is a living document of the thoughts of Samrat Pushyamitra and the common feelings of the people of those triumphant days. The festive occasion of the horse ceremony was graced with the presence of the great sages and ascetics of India, Brahmins well versed in all the Vedic lore, the high-born Kshatriya kings and princes, the prominent officers and administrators of the empire, eminent citizens and leaders in town. Patanjali, who was renowned as the greatest of the scholars and who has now come to be listed with universal approval among the world's greatest scholars, was also present on that glorious occasion. With the blessings and participation of such celebrities, the festival of that horse sacrifice naturally came to acquire the dignity and grandeur of the Indian national victory over the Malechha. After the Greeks were driven away beyond the Indus by Samrat Pushyamitra round about 190 to 180 BCE, and India was rid of all Greek dominance, the Greek race saw the beginning of their extinction. Beyond the Indus in Gandhar and Bactria, they had some small states dragging on their uncertain existence. And about the beginning of the first century of the Christian era, when a great tide of the fierce, warlike race of the Shakas from Central Asia dashed against Bactria, Persia and Gandhar, the Greeks knew not where to flee in order to escape the terrible impact of Shaka's sharp swords. They fled with wives and children, the old and the infant. At last they crossed the Indus and entered India to save their lives. But now they came as displaced persons seeking shelter. What a tragic irony! This influx of theirs was a far cry from the triumphant entry of their forefathers under Alexander and Seleucus. The latter rushed in crying hoarse for war, while the present Greeks came in begging for shelter. But India gave them shelter very graciously in those most unfortunate days, forgetting all enmity. These runaway Greeks settled wherever and whenever their separate batches could find any shelter. Some of them became converts to Buddhism while some courted Hinduism. But as Vedic Hindus alone had their states everywhere in India, these Greeks, whether they were Buddhists or Vedic Hindus, were not able to cause any sort of political trouble. They adopted the Indian languages, Indian customs, and swiftly they were merged completely in the Indian society. And because they had martial and other social relations with the Indians, within a century or two, they completely lost the sense of their separate existence as Greeks, the sense of their separate nationality. Just as a lump of salt dissolves swiftly into the torrential currents of the Ganga, in the same way, their Greek extraction was totally merged into the tidal wave of Indian life. Most of the Western historians, and our own too, have completely missed one point in this connection which, for that very reason, must be made explicit here. It is this: whether it was the Greeks or other foreign aggressors, whoever came flashing their swords, but who were ultimately conquered and engulfed, completely submerged in our society, leaving not a trace of their separate existence behind. In every case, it has been amply proved that it was only when the aggressor's insolent sword was beaten down, it was only when the aggressor was vanquished completely in the deadly armed conflict on the battlefield, that those foreigners became so very tame and pliable as to be easily overwhelmed and dissolved in our society. This was achieved not by peaceful persuasion, but by the stronger and deadlier weapons. Some of the old Buddhist books enlarge upon the cruel treatment meted out by Pushyamitra to Buddhist bhikkhus, upon the outright massacre of some of them, and the destruction of some of the Buddhist monasteries. Even the European historians have set aside all these references as exaggerated ones. Still, some of them have stated that there should be some grain of truth at the root of those exaggerated accounts, that Pushyamitra might have been guilty of some slight persecution of the Buddhists by way of revenge. We also feel that Samrat Pushyamitra might have taken good many of the Buddhists to task, but not for any philosophical or theological difference of opinion. The Buddhists were not persecuted as a class simply because they believed in nihilism or agnosticism, or because some of them were atheists, while others were non-violent on principle and condemned in the Vedas, or because their religious rituals were in many ways different from those of the Vedic Hindus. Lord Buddha himself experienced no obstacle in the propagation of his faith. Let that alone, the Buddhist faith had been more or less 300 years old by the time of Chandragupta's succession to the throne. In his undivided all-India Hindu empire, and also during the tenure of the ministerial office of the staunch Arya Chanakya, no Buddhist persecution of any sort was reported by the Greek ambassador Megasthenes, who had stayed at the court of the First Maurya Empire for years together. Megasthenes does not refer to Buddhism even by name, for they had not till then formed any anti-national and political alliance detrimental to the interests of the nation either with Alexander or Seleucus. It was not then possible for them. That is why, along with many other religionists, the Buddhists also could observe their own rituals according to their own beliefs and likings. Besides, they could openly preach by sweet persuasion and discussion. Subsequent to the invasion of Alexander and Seleucus, when the Greeks came raiding for the second time under Demetrius and Menander, and when advancing as far as Ayodhya, they were about to dethrone the reigning king of Magad and endanger the independence of the Indian Empire. At that time, the Indian Buddhists played a brazen-faced, treacherous role, as is seen from the fact that these Buddhists swore their loyalty to the Greek emperor Menander, whom they called Milend. When the latter adopted Buddhism, they accepted him as the king of the region conquered by him. The Buddhist scholars and bhikkhus proudly strutted in the Indian courts of those Greeks as if they were moving in some national court. In order to put down as sternly as possible these highly objectionable, treacherous acts of these Indian Buddhists, the plots hatched to undermine the national independence and open instigation to do anti-national acts, which went on incessantly through various Buddhist monasteries and viharas, Pushyamitra and his generals were forced, by the exigency of the time when the war was actually going on, to hang the Indian Buddhists who were guilty of seditious acts and to pull down the monasteries which had become the centers of sedition. It was a just punishment for high treason and for joining hands with the enemy, in order that Indian independence and empire might be protected. It was no religious persecution. As the supreme authority in the imperial administrative structure of India, it was Pushyamitra's duty, a religious and kingly duty according to the national legal code, to chastise perfidy, whether it was on the part of the Buddhists or on that of the Vedic Hindus. In traditional historical writings, mainly based on Buddhist myths, Ashoka has been extolled as tolerant of different religious sects, while Pushyamitra, wholly conniving at his efforts to establish religious freedom, is generally imputed with intolerance and persecution of the Buddhists. This false notion has to be corrected. If anybody is at all guilty of religious intolerance, it was Ashoka himself. For not only with verbal propaganda, but with the abuse of his regal authority, he declared as illegal all the fundamental religious rituals, such as sacrifice and hunting by the Vedic Hindus who formed the majority of his subjects. But Pushyamitra did not issue any royal decree enforcing any performances of sacrifices in the Buddha vihars or the worship of Vaishwadeva in every Buddha household, even as a fitting retort to Ashoka's injunctions. The Buddhists were as absolutely free as all other religious sects to perform their religious rites and enjoy religious freedom, so long as they abstained from any anti-national foreign contact. It is likely that in the troubled times of national war, the chastisement of the disloyal Buddhists might have affected some of the innocent ones, but it was not a rule, but an inevitable exception. What Pushyamitra really did was to reinstate the religious freedom which was annulled by Ashoka. If anybody is to be called intolerant of religious differences, it should be Ashoka and not Pushyamitra. The main reason of the general animosity that the Vedic Hindus felt towards the Buddhists and the persecution that the latter suffered at their hands from time to time is that the Buddhists oftentimes betrayed the cause of Indian independence and Indian empire. And this was the main reason for the downfall of Buddhism. Pushyamitra, who with his armed might completely exterminated the Greek intrusion, which from the time of Alexander had often caused great harm to India, and who therefore rightly deserves the title Yavana Destroyer, protected ably for 36 years, not only the independence of India which he himself had won, but brought about the many-sided development of his country, and that died peacefully in 149 BCE. In the sense in which Chandragupta's rout of the Greek pockets of influence in India is said to be the first glorious epoch of Hindu victories over aggressors, this total extinction of the Greeks in India at the hands of Yavan destroyer Pushyamitra becomes necessarily the second glorious epoch of Indian history. And with this, we come to the end of the episode number 20 of the Indologia podcast. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned something from this. If you did, please give me a good rating on whichever podcast platform you're listening to this on, especially if it's Apple or Spotify. Please give me a nice 5-star rating. You should also follow me on social media. I am on Instagram, Twitter, WhatsApp, YouTube. Just search for Indologia, Indologia. Please do send me your feedback, your criticism, your comments, whatever you want to say to me. Don't be shy. And till the next time I see you, Jai Hind, Vande Mataram.